Hello and welcome. I'm Kip Davis, a biblical scholar and a specialist in early Judaism and the Dead Sea Scrolls, and extremely sorry, I'm sorry, about my sudden and very long disappearance from YouTube. Apologies aside, here I am, finally back to offer a long overdue third response to a presentation by Michael Jones of Inspiring Philosophy on the Capturing Christianity channel titled The Reliability of Genesis 1-11. In the first and the second videos, I showed how numerous errors, false dichotomies, and straw man arguments throughout Jones's talk completely invalidate his overarching premises, that the biblical book of Genesis is internally consistent, and that Genesis as a whole was written as early as the Bronze Age. I would encourage you to go back and click on the links to watch both before stepping into this final part if you've not already done so. I would also encourage you to take the time to view Jones's video in its entirety to ensure that I'm not misrepresenting his inventory of tedious points. The topic for this video was going to be the documentary hypothesis. This is the overwhelming consensus theory of biblical scholars which holds that the Pentateuch was composed of several earlier sources. Jones spends a little time at the end of his presentation attempting to undermine this central theory as a means to demonstrate the internal consistency of Genesis. But in preparing for this video, I became pretty overwhelmed by the amount of material that I wanted to include, since the documentary hypothesis is such a robust theory for the origins of the Pentateuch. I ended up with nearly 15,000 words in my script, and as a result have decided to split this final video up into smaller, more digestible parts. So this conclusion of my rebuttal will probably comprise another 3 videos. In these videos, I will be tackling the final premise of Jones's argument, that the internal consistency of Genesis contradicts or discredits the prevailing source theories. Jones makes his case on the basis of a hackneyed presentation of the modern consensus of Pentateuch scholarship that still holds strong to various forms of the documentary hypothesis. He then provides a few key points to show literary unity and artistry within Genesis that he believes would indicate that it was written, in his words, much further back than we see in the Persian or the Babylonian time period. Because his understanding of the documentary hypothesis provided in his video appears so horribly flawed, it is nearly impossible to engage with him on its merits. As a result, in my response, I will first show Jones's errors by pointing out precisely what the documentary hypothesis isn't, before then delving into more exactly what it is, and the evidence for it in subsequent videos. Finally, with this in the background, I will proceed to finish up this series by showing how Jones's arguments for internal consistency ultimately fail in light of the well-established source theories. So, let's begin. Jones begins his proper discussion of the documentary hypothesis by insisting that it is a dated theory with a growing number of modern detractors.
Bring this up. The documentary hypothesis is not accepted by every scholar, but a lot of scholars still hold to it. It's kind of falling out of favor. It goes back and forth. I don't really know.
Okay, I have to say it right from the start. If Jones doesn't really know, then why is he presuming to speak authoritatively on this topic in the first place?
I could quote from Richard Hess's book here. For example, he says that Yezekiel Kaufman argues for a pre-exilic P in the middle of the 8th century, whereas other scholars doubt this. Zevet argues it could date to the late 10th century. Wenham places P before J. Redtorff and Wenham identified J and E as originally one document. Van Cedars has argued for a later date for J, while Birds defends an earlier monarchy date. Bloom argues for the union of two compositions, a decomposition, This is a later and influenced by an earlier D, and a P composition. He keeps going on. He goes on for another half a page, but argues there's so many different documentary hypotheses. It's almost a little comical. No one can agree on what the original sources for the Pentateuch were. It's thrown all over the place.
As is common with evangelical apologists, he denigrates the documentary hypothesis on the basis of the wide variety of views among scholars, calling it comical that disagreements about the formation of the Pentateuch continue to persist. Let's stop for a minute and look at the substance of these arguments. I will get to a more developed description of the documentary hypothesis shortly, but for now, it suffices to note that the exceptional majority of biblical scholars agree that the Pentateuch was formed from earlier sources, and that 4 of the most common sources identified are the Yahweh source, or J, the Elohist source, E, Deuteronomy, or D, and a priestly source, P. It is crucial to observe that the essential disagreement among scholars is not about the existence or nature of the sources. Most of the complaints cited here by Jones have to do rather with dating and scope. Kaufman, Zevet, Wenham, and Bloom all affirm the existence of P. Wenham, Rentdorf, and Van Seters are all in agreement about the existence of some form of non-P material identified loosely as J or JE. The disagreements are not about the broad outlines of source theory, but otherwise have to do with how to situate the individual source material ideologically and chronologically. What virtually all of these scholars, and the vast majority of Hebrew Bible scholars more generally, agree on is the fact that the Pentateuch is composed of sources, and that some of these sources, such as P and D, are easily recognized. To cite one of these befuddled blokes, the basic presupposition is that the Pentateuch is not a literary unity, but instead developed over time and is comprised of different literary layers. This presupposition is not arbitrary, but instead responds to the problems presented by the text itself. In all the hypotheses, scholars are in agreement that the Pentateuch or Hexateuch is composed of at least 3 strata: Deuteronomy, the priestly writing, including the Holiness Code, and the non-priestly text in Genesis Numbers. Everything else is open for discussion. In the words of another, there is no doubt that the documentary hypothesis does not provide a full explanation of the complicated process by which the Pentateuch was formed. What these modifications of the basic hypothesis and continuing disagreements about such issues of dating show is that the evidence, the repetitions, the inconsistencies, and the contradictions is extremely complex. But they must be explained, and almost all scholars agree with the general principles that underlying the present text of the first 5 books of the Bible are distinct sources. A majority of scholars, if by no means all, continue to follow some version of the classic formulation of the documentary hypothesis. And finally, one more. Pentateuchal criticism did not arise because a number of ill-natured or blasphemous scholars said, "Here is a beautifully unified and coherent work. How can we chop it into little bits?" It arose because observable discrepancies within the Pentateuchal narrative, very many of which had been noticed for hundreds of years before, bore in upon scholars that it is very difficult to see what kind of literature such a rambling and inconsistent work could possibly be. We may say that once scholars raised the question of what kind of genre of writing the Pentateuch was, they were forced to see that it was, from a literary point of view, ambiguous. A work which consists of narrative mixed with poems and hymns and laws, which contains 2 or even 3 versions of the same story, set down with no apparent awareness that they are the same, and which changes style so drastically from paragraph to paragraph and from verse to verse, cannot, in a certain sense, be read at all. You simply don't know where you are with it. A rambling and inconsistent work. You simply don't know where you are with it. I think one of the most offensive aspects in the response by evangelicals to the documentary hypothesis is their utter failure to appreciate the multiple voices throughout the Pentateuch, but moreover, their failure to grasp the exceptional mastery of the biblical editors for how they combine the sources into such an exquisite composition. It would be one thing if critics like Jones actually dealt with the evidence of the source theories in order to overturn them, but they don't. Instead, we are left with ham-fisted caricatures like this.
You have Deuteronomy, you have the J source, these are the Yahweh passages. And sometimes you see in the Pentateuch, they don't say Yahweh, they say Elohim. Well, that comes from a different source, the E source. Then you have priestly material that's inserted in as well, and that you get the Pentateuch.
This is illustrative of a second problem. Critics like Jones have a tendency to oversimplify the extremely complicated depth of the documentary hypothesis as a means to discredit it. To hear him tell it, the entire theory is based on the different usages of words to identify God and unspecified distinctions between Deuteronomy and priestly material. If that was all there was to it, then no one should accept any form of this theory. Jones shows two diagrams illustrating an early version of the source theory and a later, more developed one as a means to sow confusion about their crucial details, and all the while, at no time does he actually engage with any aspects of the theory itself. Instead, he hand-waves at what appear to be significant differences between them and dismisses them, without any explanation as to their contents or merit. Let's actually take a close look at the modeled examples that Jones has provided. The first is the basic outline as it was originally proposed by Wellhausen and Graf in the 19th century. J and E were written in the 9th century BCE and combined sometime after the reign of Hezekiah. D and P were written independently in the 7th or 6th centuries, and all four sources were brought together to form the Pentateuch during or following the exile. The second comes with no dates attached, and it is very clearly a more complex, nuanced graphic presentation. However, if one understands what appears within the diagram, then the differences here from the first model are in fact fairly insignificant. Like in the first, J and E were written independently at around the same time and were later combined. This combined text is a source for both the original core of Deuteronomy and for P. The Deuteronomy source is presented as having been written close to the same time that J and E were combined and was later added to, and then achieved its form as we basically know it in Deuteronomy, close to the time that P was composed. D was then the source document for the Deuteronomistic history, which appeared in Samuel and Kings. Finally, redactors reworked all of the JE document, P and D, when they were combined to form the Torah. So what are the actual differences? The second model provides a more nuanced view of the formation of D, of the interrelationships between the earlier sources, and of the editorial activity that occurred in the combination of the sources. That's it. So one is left to wonder, what is it specifically about the documentary hypothesis that Jones rejects and why? Since he has provided not even an adequate description of the source theory and has followed that with no rebuttal to the mountains of evidence for it, there's nothing here worthy of a response. But what is certainly warranted instead is a proper presentation of the documentary hypothesis, what it is, how we know it, and why scholars remain so convinced of its explanatory power, despite their disagreements concerning its finer details. For centuries from the time of the formation of the Bible, beginning around the 3rd or 2nd century BCE, it was accepted first by Jews and then also by Christians that Moses was the author of the first 5 books: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Together, these came to be known as the Torah in Hebrew or the Pentateuch in Greek. This view was grounded in the occasional mention in Exodus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy of Moses writing down the words of Yahweh or writing this law. This idea was also picked up by other biblical authors. Joshua 8:31 tells us that Joshua's actions were in accordance with what Moses, the servant of Yahweh, instructed the sons of Israel, what is written in the book of the Torah of Moses. In 1 Kings 2:3, it says, "Keep the charges of Yahweh your God, to walk in all of his ways, to keep his precepts, his instructions, his decrees, and his testimonies as they are written in the Torah of Moses." Now, there are a few important things of note here. First off, these descriptions of Moses' authorship appear nowhere in Genesis nor in Leviticus. On the face of it, these books are anonymous. Second, there is different terminology employed in these texts, and this is one of the indicators to scholars that they stem from different sources. In Exodus, Moses is instructed to write the words of Yahweh, while in Deuteronomy and later passages, he is to write this Torah. The word Torah in Hebrew is often translated into English as law, and it is subsequently then applied to the entire contents of the Pentateuch. But in the book of Deuteronomy and the later so-called closely related Deuteronomistic history in Samuel and Kings, it is used in a specified manner to distinguish a particular piece of writing, this Torah. For most scholars, every instance of this construction does not refer to the entire Pentateuch, nor even to all the legal material in Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy. Rather, it is with exclusive reference only to Deuteronomy, or at least to the core of Deuteronomy as it was known to later biblical authors. Again, this is part of how we identify at least one of the sources. Third, something needs to be said for the power of writing in later antiquity, as it was used to confer special authority on various ideas and doctrines. For the author of Deuteronomy, we will come to see that he is working from a religious and political agenda, and it serves his purposes to ascribe this directly to a renowned figure like Moses. This is an idea that is later propagated throughout the post-exilic period. The Book of Jubilees, which was written in the 2nd century BCE, employs this same device in authorizing its own contents. This is a book which situates the events from the destruction of Jerusalem by the Babylonians in 587 BCE to the desecration of the Second Temple by the Seleucid Emperor Antiochus IV in 167 BCE. And it packages this all into the divine plan of Yahweh, which is called the division of the times for the law and the testimony. In an effort to bolster the credibility of the writing, the author has set the composition of his work in the hand of Moses himself and at the direction of God through a divine mediary called the Angel of the Presence. It says, "Write for yourself all these words which I declare unto thee on this mountain, the first and the last things, and that which will come about during the division of the times, for the law and the testimony, and for weeks and the jubilees forever, until I come down and dwell with them for all the ages of eternity." And he told the angel of the presence, that is, God told the angel of the presence, to write for Moses about the period from the beginning of the creation until my sanctuary is built in their midst for all eternity. An especially interesting case of this phenomenon, which we identify as pseudepigraphy, appears in the remarkable manuscript from the Dead Sea Scrolls known as the Temple Scroll. This document was the largest scroll discovered in the Judean desert, measuring 8.146 meters, containing text in 65 preserved columns, but without the beginning of the manuscript. This text is a lengthy and elaborate set of instructions for the construction and operation of the temple, which conflates rules of sacrifices and ceremony from Exodus and Leviticus with a revised version of the Deuteronomic Code from Deuteronomy 12 to 26. The most astonishing thing about this text is that it is written in the first person and promotes itself as a direct revelation from the hand of God Himself. For example, here is the text of Deuteronomy 13 verses 1 to 5, juxtaposed with the reworked version in the temple scroll. You must be careful to do everything that I have commanded you today. You are neither to add to them nor subtract from them. If there appears in your midst a prophet or a dream diviner, and he gives you a sign or a portent, and the sign or portent that he declared to you takes place, saying, "Let us go and serve other gods, whom you have not known," do not listen to the words of that prophet or dream diviner, for I am testing you to know whether you really love Yahweh, the God of your fathers, with all your heart and soul. Walk after Yahweh your God, fear Him, keep His commandments, obey His instructions, serve Him, and hold fast to Him. But those prophets or those who divine by dreams shall be executed for speaking treason against Yahweh your God, who brought you out of Egypt. I redeemed you from the house of bondage, turning you astray from the way in which I have commanded you to walk. Thus you shall purge the evil from your midst. For most scholars, this is precisely what occurred in the writing of Deuteronomy. The late ascription to Moses imbued the truly revolutionary content of this new document with authority and demanded that it be taken seriously. The idea of Mosaic authorship of the entire Torah, or the Pentateuch, is a product of the post-exilic editorial activity when the first 5 books were first put together, and the authority of Moses derived from Deuteronomy was applied then to the entire collection. The problem of Mosaic authorship for the entire Torah was something that was noticed by scholars for centuries. For example, the premier Jewish textual expert of the 11th century, Avraham ibn Ezra, had pointed to several verses as impossibly written by Moses. Genesis 12:6 implied that there were no longer Canaanites living in the Promised Land, which would clearly post-date Moses. Or the parenthetical note in Genesis 22:14, "as it is today," would indicate a long-standing traditional view which could not have existed until long after Moses' death. The typical approach to dealing with such complications was retreating into the familiar ground of the traditional view and the maintenance of developing ideas about inspiration and inerrancy of Scripture as reflections of its divine origins. These ideas are expressed in different ways, but the former star professor of Hebrew at Harvard University, James L. Kugel, has very helpfully articulated this view in the 4 assumptions shared by all pre-modern interpreters of the Bible. First, the Bible was fundamentally a cryptic text. That is, the Bible's inherent meaning is not always plainly obvious, but that embedded within the words, and even in the absence of words, there were deeper, more profound nuggets of truth lying beneath the surface. Second, the Bible was a book of lessons directed to the reader's present day. The Bible was less history than it was instruction, and via every telling of the past there were truths to be gleaned pertaining to the present. Third, the Bible contained no contradictions or mistakes, and the existence of apparent contradictions were easily resolved by harmonizing texts through clever gymnastic apologetics. Fourth, the Bible was divinely given by God through his prophets. But amid the dramatic political and religious shifts in the 17th and 18th centuries, challenges to the traditional view became more frequent and demonstrably more pronounced. In 1670, Benedict Spinoza published Tractatus Theologica Politicus, which read like a direct challenge to the four assumptions. Scripture was to be read and understood literally and within the confines of its own language and culture. Scripture ought to be read in the very limited context of its setting in life, and not as a jackpot of eternal truths for today. Scripture was frequently at odds with itself, rife with contradictions from one prophet to the next, and most damningly and increasingly with the growing numbers of discoveries of modern science. By the 18th century, the French royal court physician Jean Astruc astutely observed that the usage of two words for identifying God, Yahweh and Elohim, seemed to suggest that the Pentateuch was cobbled together from different sources. For example, in Genesis 4 and 5, there are two parallel versions of the same genealogy from Adam to Lamech. The first consistently and exclusively identifies God as Yahweh, and the second only as Elohim. Astruc's discovery became the point of departure for investigations into the nature of Pentateuchal narrative, which dominated the following century, and eventually set the grounding of the first proposed documentary hypothesis by German scholars K.H. Graf and Julius Wellhausen. And while it is most simply understood on the basis of the different usages for the name of God, this point is often promoted by evangelical interpreters such as our friend Michael Jones here to an illustration of absurdity. The common tack for pop apologists like him is not to grapple with any of the actual features of the documentary hypothesis, preferring rather to construct straw man responses to bullet points like these.
You have Deuteronomy, you have the J source, these are the Yahweh
Sometimes
passages. You see in the Pentateuch, they don't say Yahweh, they say Elohim. Well, that comes from a different source. Then you have priestly material that's inserted as well, and that you get the Pentateuch.
My issue with this is that it is so laughably simplistic as to be completely disingenuous. On the face of it, this sort of description makes the documentary hypothesis appear as exceedingly flimsy and desperate, which is why it is so necessary to work through the features of all the arguments, and to see why scholars for nearly 150 years have found these ideas to be so powerful and compelling. The enormous amounts of evidence for the documentary hypothesis is something that we shall look at carefully in the next video.